story of World War II usually plays out in the shadows of giants. Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, and Eisenhower. But beyond the war rooms and strategy tables, something more extraordinary unfolds. Across Britain and Europe, young pilots from all over the world, just 19 to 24 years of age, climb into the cockpits of cutting-edge flying machines, drawn to the promise of glory and a place in the history books. But the skies soon turn hostile. The thrills fade as the odds mount. An awful realization sets in that they have embarked upon an adventure they can no longer control, one that many of them are not going to survive. Yet still they keep flying, again and again, not out of duty alone, but because something inside them refuses to break. You and I may well speak of honor, duty, and sacrifice, but in the reality of those moments between fear and fire, steel and silence, what you come upon isn't just a war story. It's the war within the war.
The Midnight News, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it. Up to 10 o'clock, 175 German aircraft had been destroyed in today's raids over this country. Today was the most costly for the German Air Force for nearly a month.
Patterson Clarence Hughes is born on September the 19th, 1917, in the rural settlement of New Morella, New South Wales, Australia. He is the 11th of 12 children born to Percy and Catherine Hughes, and the youngest of 5 sons. From an early age, Pat displays a natural athleticism, excelling in rugby, football, and swimming. But it is the romance of the skies that truly captures Pat's imagination. Enthralled by tales of First World War dogfights, Pat builds model aeroplanes and tinkers with crystal radio sets. Pat begins his schooling at Cooma Public School, remaining there until 12, when the family relocates to Sydney. At Petersham Boys' School, Pat quickly distinguishes himself. He's appointed prefect in 1932 and rises to vice captain the following year. He later enrolls at Fort Street High School, though he leaves after 8 months to take up a clerical role here at the distinguished Saunders Jewellers on George Street, Sydney. But Pat Hughes is not destined to lead a quiet life behind a retail counter. In 1937, aged just 18, Pat enlists in the Royal Australian Air Force and commences his flight training at Point Cook, Victoria. Upon graduation, Pat is offered a short service commission with the Royal Air Force in Britain. In January 1937, Pat set sail for the old country aboard the RMS Narkunda, alongside other Australian flyers such as Desmond Sheen and Bob Cosgrove. Upon arrival, Pat is posted to number 2 Flying Training School at RAF Digby, where his abilities in the air will be put to the test. Pat Hughes proves to be a natural pilot and an emerging leader, calm under pressure, instinctively sure-handed in the air. His talent does not go unnoticed. Still clad in his darker Royal Australian Air Force uniform, Pat is posted to number 64 Squadron at RAF Martlesham Heath in Suffolk. Soon after, he joins the recently reformed 234 Squadron at RAF Leconfield in East Yorkshire. Pat is promoted to acting flight lieutenant and assumes command of one of its flights.
At first, 234 finds itself equipped with a curious medley of obsolescence. Fairey Battles, Bristol Blenheims, Gloucester Gauntlets, aircraft that already feel like the relics of a fading era. But on March the 14th, 1940, the transformation begins. The Supermarine Spitfire Mark I arrives.
The Spitfire is no ordinary machine. It is the embodiment of modern air power, the very cutting edge of Britain's defensive might. Sleek, fast and lethal, it captures the imagination of all who see it.
The effect on these pilots at Leconfield is immediate. Love at first sight. These aircraft are not just tools of war, they will become deadly extensions of those who will fly them into battle.
Each fully equipped and armed Spitfire in the spring of 1940 can cost up to £13,000 to produce, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to well over £800,000 today. With their new steeds, the men of 234 now find themselves at the forefront of Britain's air strategy, and with that distinction comes a certain confidence.
It is not difficult to imagine them, laughter echoing, shoes scuffing the pub floor as they crowd into the Beverley Arms to claim their evening rations of camaraderie and ale.
One night, Pat sweeps in, not alone, but accompanied by an excitable Airedale puppy tucked under one arm. He introduces the squirming creature to the squadron as Flying Officer Butch. The dog soon becomes a fixture at Leconfield, notorious for his unruly charm and endless appetite for trouble.
On another evening, Pat navigates the smoke-hazed warmth of the Beverley's interior and makes his way over to where his men are seated at a table near the bar. As he approaches, his eye catches a figure which momentarily arrests him. A striking young woman with auburn hair, immaculately dressed, mid-laughter, deep in conversation with the squadron boys.
It is, by all accounts, one of those textbook cinematic moments. Kathleen Broderick turns and sees for the first time the tall, broad-shouldered Australian officer. Uniform immaculate, his presence unmistakable.
Whether Flying Officer Butch himself is present for this fateful encounter, cradled at high port, tail wagging, ears perked, is a detail regrettably lost to history.
At first, Kathleen, known to friends and family as Kay, is unmoved by Pat's swagger and self-assurance. His charm, though undeniable, strikes her as bordering on the arrogant.
I thought he was conceited. He asked me to telephone him. I didn't.
A few days later, Pat phones Kay and asks her out. What begins as a flirtation quickly deepens into something more. Though theirs might appear to be a match made in heaven, it won't be without its turbulence, flak bursts, and strafing runs.
Kay is a strong-willed Yorkshire lady with no tolerance for nonsense. Pat, the boisterous Australian, unaccustomed to resistance when issuing orders. Neither yields easily, and they are utterly besotted with one another. The day before Operation Dynamo begins at Dunkirk, Number 234 Squadron is ordered to move 30 miles west from Leconfield to RAF Church Fenton. Here, in the quiet of England's north, they train, eyes fixed on the skies, knowing what's coming.
To Pat, the Spitfire is unmatched. Its elliptical wings deliver lift with minimal drag, giving it an edge in turning fights.
In a turn, the Spit was better than the Messerschmitt.
I know the Spitfire could outturn the 109. You'll still find the odd 109 pilot who claimed differently, but I'm sure they hadn't found competent Spitfire pilots against them. On 2 occasions, I saved my life by outturning a 109.
The cockpit offers superb visibility. Its flight characteristics are forgiving, ideal for green pilots thrown into deadly skies. But the Spitfire is no perfect machine. In a steep dive, it struggles. Its climb rate lags behind the German Messerschmitt 109. The 109E4 carries the Daimler-Benz DB601, a fuel-injected engine that thrives in negative G. Push the stick forward and the engine keeps firing. The Spitfire's Merlin, carburetted. In a steep dive or under other negative G conditions, the Merlin chokes, floods with fuel, and may cut out altogether. It's a fatal flaw unless you know how to compensate.
Who the hell's he trying to kid?
But the 109 has its own fatal flaw: range. It can fight for 15 minutes over southern England, but no more. One miscalculation, one dogfight too many, and the pilot has no way home. His options: crash land, bail out, or ditch in the English Channel. The 109's guns, though, are terrifying. A 20mm cannon in each wing and 2 machine guns above the engine. Just 9 seconds of cannon fire, but if that hits, that's all it's going to take to tear a Spitfire apart. The Spitfire and Hurricane are equipped with 303 Browning machine guns. Much lighter, less punch, but you've got 8 Brownings and 15 seconds of fire. And with precision, it will do the job. Pat's worked it out. You've got to get in close. Very close. At Church Fenton, the days are full of drills, patrols, and tactical planning. Even so, Pat and Kay steal a few precious afternoons, picnics in the Yorkshire countryside, quiet moments away from the roar of engines and the burden of what's coming. Then in mid-June, another blow. 234 is ordered to relocate to RAF St Evell in Cornwall, 285 miles to the southwest, and far away from Kay. From his new post, Pat places a long-distance call to Kay. He asks her to marry him. The plan is simple and immediate. They'll wed at the register office in Bodmin, just 11 miles from the base. Kay hesitates. In another life, she might wait until war's end, for certainty. But her mother is unequivocal. Take happiness while it can be had. When next the lovers speak, Kay says yes.
What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin.
As June fades into July, Cornwall remains untouched by the worst of the war thus far. 234 continues training and conducts patrols over convoys along the coast. Then, on July the 8th, a call comes through. Enemy aircraft sighted. Pat leads a section out late in the day and climbs through a fractured sky to provide cover for the ships below. Above the cloud deck, a Junkers Ju-88 breaks through the mist, attempting to escape Lawrence and Bailey, maintaining close escort of the convoy. Pat angles in from above. Lawrence attacks first, then Pat closes to within 50 yards and unleashes the Brownings. The Spitfire trembles as rounds tear into the bomber. Pat breaks off and Bailey follows up with a final burst. The Junkers drops low, losing altitude rapidly, and finally ditches in the sea. The crew are seen clambering out with life jackets, after which the aircraft slips beneath the waves. It is 234 Squadron's first confirmed kill.
While everyone considers it a good outcome, Pat takes Lawrence and Bailey to task. Why open fire from 600 yards? You've got no chance of a clean hit. You're just wasting ammunition. You've got to get in close. Make every bullet count.
August the 1st. Pat is granted a 24-hour pass for a mission of a different kind. Kay has made the arduous 400-mile drive down from Hull on rationed petrol. Together, they exchange their vows at the Bodmin Register office.
No one from the squadron is available to act as witnesses. Flying Officer Butch regrettably does not meet legal criteria, so two obliging strangers bear witness to the union.
The newlyweds' honeymoon is brief but fiercely cherished. A single day and night in a modest cottage at Trianon Beach, a few windswept miles from RAF St Eville. Two weeks later, orders arrive with no ceremony. 234 Squadron is to relocate to RAF Middle Wallop in Hampshire. Pat and Kay agree to lock up the Cornwall cottage, and Kay drives the 210 miles east to the White Hart at Andover, a modest inn that will become her makeshift new home.
As for the squadron, the arrival of 234's ground crew at Middle Wallop is anything but routine. The war has come to meet them. Luftwaffe bombers are hitting the base as they drive in. One hangar takes a direct hit. Several ground crew and civilian contractors are killed. And then, without warning, Pat finds himself in charge.
August the 13th, 1940. Squadron leader Richard Barnett, who has yet to fly an operational sortie, steps down following a tense interview with Air Vice Marshal Sir Christopher Brand, head of 10 Group. Just a week earlier, 234's other flight commander, Flight Lieutenant John Tileman, had also withdrawn from service, grounded by a serious asthma condition.
With scarcely time to reflect, Pat assumes the role of 234's acting commanding officer. A new CO, Squadron Leader Joseph Spike O'Brien, is officially appointed 4 days later. But for 234's pilots, Flight Lieutenant Pat Hughes is already the squadron's centre of gravity. And not a moment too soon.
Mid-August, ceasefighter command plunged headlong into near-constant engagements across the south. Luftwaffe formations flood the skies. RAF squadrons are scrambled multiple times daily, invariably outnumbered, yet still they rise. The long months of preparation now start paying dividends. Time after time, 234's pilots throw themselves into the melee. The 109s, formidable on paper, are vulnerable on their way home, dancing dangerously close to their fuel margins.
Pat, as usual, leads from the front, now pressing his attacks to within 30 yards of his victim, before discharging his Brownings in short but highly accurate 2-second bursts.
August the 15th. Pat shoots down a Bf-110 and shares another. The very next day, 2 Messerschmitt 109s fall to his guns. 2 more 109s are dispatched on the 18th. 1 week later, 2 more 109s again. The tally climbs, but so does the pressure.
All that mattered was getting airborne, fighting the war, surviving until the next day, day after day after day.
The existential whiplash of Pat's days begins to weigh heavily. Mortal combat in the skies, followed by evenings at the White Hart with Kay, Butch and the squadron. The heady 100-octane stench of warfare and life in split screen, the no man's land between war and whiskey, death and laughter. The tension is ever present. Pat is starting to sense, maybe more keenly than most, that this will not let up, that he might not make it. Over drinks one evening, he half jokes with Kay. In case of accidents, make sure you marry again.
The German strategy is no longer a mystery. It is not simply to harass, but to break, to grind the RAF into the grass before unleashing a full-scale invasion of the British Isles.
But by early September, a different truth begins to emerge. The more Spitfires and Hurricanes the Luftwaffe shoots down, the more seem to be waiting for them in the skies the following morning. And many are no longer flown by beginners. September the 4th. 234 Squadron is up once more and vectored east towards Tangmere to intercept a formidable formation. 65 Messerschmitt 110s this time, sweeping in from the channel. Pat leads Blue Section into the fray and sights the enemy just south of Hazelmere. Picks his first target, opens fire at 100 yards with a controlled 2-second burst, then presses home the attack, closing to within 3 Spitfire lengths of the jinking victim before finishing it off. The sky becomes a churning stadium of shells and smoke. Over 15 intense minutes of aerial combat, the lethal but lumbering 110s, outclassed and outflown by the RAF, attempt to scatter under the assault. Pat downs 3 in rapid succession. The squadron as a whole claims 11 more, along with a Dornier bomber. September the 5th, early afternoon. The scramble bell clangs and 234 is airborne anew, this time directed towards Kenley. Over Gravesend, they're ambushed by a swarm of Messerschmitt 109s. The fight that follows is brutal and unforgiving. Pat engages a 109, striking true. His rounds rip into the Germans' ammunition bays, triggering a fireball that consumes the fighter as it spirals down into farmland near Eastchurch. Pat immediately locks onto another. At near point-blank range, he releases a sustained 6-second burst which ruptures the German's oil tank. The doomed pilot can do nothing, while behind him, Pat's wings are slicked with oil from the stricken 109, which is torn apart mid-flight and plunges earthward. The jarring duality of Pat's world once again makes itself felt. The cold reality of aerial combat in the morning, the quiet pint with Kay at the White Hart by nightfall. How do you explain a dirty war to a clean heart? Kay watches her husband absently stroking Butch curled in his lap. His eyes are distant, beyond exhausted. They quietly speak about Kay returning to Hull, at least until the worst is over. Andover town was bombed a few weeks back. Who's to say it won't happen again? A plan is made. Kay will drive the long road back to Cornwall to collect their belongings and shutter the cottage, then return to Andover and the White Hart on Saturday. After that, if the situation warrants, she'll drive north back to her mother's in Hull. No one likes the plan, but both understand the wisdom. September the 6th, 1940. 234 Squadron is scrambled once more, intercepting 109s high above East Kent. Pat claims one confirmed destroyed and another probable. Later, he and the squadron return to Middle Wallop's forward operating base at Warmwell to refuel, rearm, then go up again. The tempo is unrelenting. A second sortie in the early afternoon, then a third at 17:30 hours, this time vectored east towards Brooklands in Surrey.
Across Europe in the heart of the Reich, Hitler has run out of patience. The invasion of Britain cannot proceed until the RAF has been cleared from the skies. Not only is that not happening, the Luftwaffe's daily losses, as well as their inability to shut down even just 11 groups' airfields, lends the lie that fighter command is on the brink of extinction.
Worse, Britain's Bomber Command has now started night raids on Berlin after a hapless German bomber became lost on a raid and bombed London. Churchill orders an immediate reprisal attack on the sacred German capital, which enrages Hitler. Now the order goes out, endorsed by Goering and Kesselring. The Luftwaffe is commanded to level British cities and to get started with London. September the 7th, 1940. A balmy summer's day. Oddly, nothing happens. A kettle sings in a dispersal hut. Fighter pilots doze in deck chairs. Others play cricket or read a book, flapping away flies. A rare moment of calm. But across the channel, the Luftwaffe assembles, and Goering himself has travelled to the Pas de Calais to witness it. It takes time to marshal the largest air raid in history. An aerial armada stretching across an 86-mile front, effectively from North Foreland to Beachy Head. When it finally moves, 348 bombers and 617 fighters set their compass headings for London. RAF Fighter Command has seen the raid amassing. Scrambles around 25 squadrons across 11 groups. At RAF Middle Wallop, the scrambled order comes to nail the enemy raiders as they turn for home. 234 Squadron is soon airborne. Squadron leader Spike O'Brien and Flight Lieutenant Pat Hughes lead their fighters east towards London's raging fires that now darken the skies.
This is Cressy leader. Look out for fighters. Anna 2, jetzt Dietrich über Munster. Wo ist denn die Royal Air Force, huh? Here we go, gentlemen. Bloody hell! This is Cressy leader. Red and green will take the fighters. Blue and yellow, you run the bombers. Break, break, break! This is Blue leader. 2 follow me in. I'm going for the lame duck.
I'll check your oil, miss. Can't be too careful.
Meanwhile, Kay is on her way back from Cornwall to Andover with their belongings. She stops at a phone box and calls the airfield to say that she's 60 minutes away and asks after Pat. Bish Owens, the adjutant, takes the call and tells her to come straight to the station.
You're all set, miss. Have a lovely day. Are you all right, miss?
When Kay arrives at the base, the boys of the squadron are waiting for her outside. But another boy is missing. Flying Officer Butch. Butch was famous for roaming the officers' mess, a four-legged mascot of chaos. On more than one occasion, contrary to Air Ministry regulations, Butch is rumoured to have taken to the skies with Pat during training flights. Fellow pilot Bob Doe would later quip that Flying Officer Butch had logged more hours in a Spitfire than some of the newer pilots. For years to come, stories would swirl that the Airedale was flying shotgun with his master on that final, fateful mission. In truth, though, Butch was always grounded, always at Middle Wallop. And then, strangely, unaccountably, he was seen charging out of the mess that very same afternoon, never to be seen again, which only added to Kay's utter desolation.
Some Battle of Britain accounts will tell you that no one can say for certain to this day what brought Pat Hughes down. His extreme close-range tactics are the obvious suspect. Pilot Officer Robert Doe, who at the time was climbing to engage the 109s above, would later describe Pat as, quote, a go-getter who believed in getting in close and doing something dangerous.
Pat's story has been told many times, but is there anything more to discover? Let's take a look. September the 7th marks the first of 57 consecutive days of bombing London, the beginning of what comes to be known as the Blitz.
Pat Hughes and 234 are vectored in by Fighter Command not to intercept the bombers on their way in, but on the Luftwaffe's return leg to France. This is the most dangerous phase of the mission for the enemy, and the most advantageous for the RAF.
By this point, German fighter pilots are burning the last of their fuel. The smart ones avoid unnecessary combat, because an extended dogfight here doesn't end in a safe landing in France. It ends pancaked in the Kent field, or ditched in the English Channel. A 10-group intelligence combat summary, based on 234 Squadron's own returns, tells us that Pat attacks alone Dornier, a straggler below the main bomber stream, possibly already damaged. Pat closes for the kill. Two further factors are baked into Pat's final mission. In the days leading up to September the 7th, Pat Hughes has been showing signs of battle fatigue, eye strain, exhaustion. Hardly surprising after weeks of near constant scrambling. But there's another factor to consider. Pat's combat instincts are honed against fast, agile fighters. He excels at closing hard and fast on Messerschmitt 109s. Bombers are different, slower, heavier, and prone to shedding large pieces when hit. Several veterans later suggested that Pat may have applied fighter pursuit tactics to a very different kind of target and come unstuck. With Pat attacking, the German pilot almost certainly puts his Dornier into a steep dive, a standard Luftwaffe tactic to gain speed when under attack. Pilot Officer Keith Lawrence, Pat's number 2, Blue 2, follows him in, his attention split between the attack and the threat of enemy fighters.
I saw a piece fly off the enemy bomber. Then the wing folded. Immediately after, I saw a Spitfire, which I assumed to be Blue 1, spinning down with about a third of a wing broken.
Lawrence is immediately drawn back into the wider battle, while somewhere far below, 234 Squadron's brightest star is falling. As the action disappears from the view of the pilots above, it is picked up by people on the ground. Outside his home near Sundridge, Home Guard trooper Charles Hall reports seeing 2 airmen leave their aircraft. One parachute opens, one does not. Charles's son Desmond later recalls hearing what he described as the awesome wailing of racing engines as the aircraft fell. This matters, because if these events are unfolding 3 to 4 miles up, none of this can be seen and none of it can be heard from the ground. So either the Halls are mistaken or they are eyewitnesses to a violent sequence playing out at a far lower altitude. So let's start with the geography, because the geography tells us altitude. The Dornier comes down here on the bank of the River Darrant. Pat Spitfire X4009 impacts here in a field off Dry Hill Lane, just south of the A25. And Pat himself exits the aircraft, but his parachute never deploys. He comes down here in the back garden of a bungalow beside the A25. These locations are close together. That matters. If this catastrophe had happened 3 to 4 miles high, the debris field would be spread across miles of countryside. It isn't. Pat comes down just over half a mile from his Spitfire and barely a quarter of a mile from the Dornier. Conclusion? Whatever happened here happened at low altitude, which checks out with what Charles and Desmond Hall say they witnessed. To understand what actually occurs in these final seconds, I'm turning to expert historians and aircraft specialists, not to speculate, but to interpret the physical evidence. The first is historian Simon Parry, compiler of the Battle of Britain Combat Archive, one of the most detailed records of RAF air combat ever assembled. When Simon's volume arrives, covering September the 7th, 1940, the front cover stops me cold. It depicts Pat Hughes striking the Dornier. In his account of the engagement, Simon highlights a piece of physical evidence recovered years later. When the Dornier is excavated in 1984, investigators discover a British .303 round embedded in one of the Dornier's engine cowling fasteners. The round has not been fired. It is intact, still held in its clip. There is only one way an unfired British round ends up driven into German metal. It must be physically forced in, driven in by a violent close-quarters impact. To understand what that kind of impact does to aircraft in flight, I spoke to Stephen Vizard, Battle of Britain historian and warbird restorer at Airframe Assemblies Limited. When Pat Spitfire was excavated in 1969, it showed the signature of what Steve referred to as a classic tailwheel job, the fuselage driven almost straight down into the earth with enormous force. Finally, I'm travelling to Hawkinge to meet Dave Brocklehurst, chairman and historian of the Kent Battle of Britain Museum Trust. Dave says he has a number of items I might find of interest. Merlin engines, airframes awaiting restoration, an Aladdin's cave of wartime memorabilia and evidence. In the German hangar, Dave shows me artifacts recovered from the Dornier itself. Here's one of its 9-cylinder radial engines. Here, further components of the Dornier recovered from the River Darrant. And here, a propeller blade from the German bomber pierced by a British .303 machine gun round. And here, the firing button from Pat's Spitfire that probably shot it. Here's a photograph of Charles Hall, standing next to the Dornier's tail fin, which was recovered separately, torn apart and badly distorted. You don't get this kind of damage from 303 fire. To shear a bomber's tail requires enormous force. Force consistent with collision. Which brings us to the last unknown, Pat's final seconds. Pat gets out of the Spitfire. To do that, he must retract or jettison the aircraft canopy, release his Sutton harness, and then physically force himself clear of the cockpit into the slipstream. All the while, the aircraft is spinning uncontrollably, exerting obstructive forces upon Pat as it plunges to Earth with half its wing missing. So we can be certain that at the precise moment Pat leaves X4009, he is alive and active. The question is, what happens next? Why doesn't Pat's parachute save him? There are 4 possibilities. 1. Pat loses consciousness almost immediately after leaving the aircraft, in which case the parachute would remain packed. 2. Pat attempts to deploy it, but the parachute fails, in which case the parachute would be seen or found to be partially deployed. 3. Pat strikes the tailplane upon exit, or is incapacitated by the violent G-forces, in which case no parachute is deployed. 4. Even with a successful exit, Pat pulls the cord, but there is simply too little altitude left. Once again, in this instance, the parachute would be found partially deployed. We have the testimony of those watching from the ground. Charles Hall and his son Desmond observe a body falling. So does Mr. Ackhurst of nearby Warren Farm. But no one reports any sign of an attempted parachute deployment. So, taken together, the evidence doesn't point to a parachute that failed. It points to a parachute that was never used. So, one final question to address. Where is Pat's official recovery report? We've searched Kent's ARP ledgers, Sevenoaks Town Council archives, the local war diaries, the police incident registers, the Kent archives at Maidstone, the National Archives at Kew, the Civil Defence logs, and we have exhaustively searched Pat's Air 81 RAF casualty file. None of these archives or documents contain any recovery details at all. Not even page 18 of the Air 81, the crash circulation signal marked secret, just gives Pat's basic information. No injuries described, no parachute status, nothing about the wreck. The silence is telling, but not entirely unexpected. Many recovery records from 1940 either never made it into central archives, or they were lost during wartime consolidations and later clearances. But here's what matters. Even without that single document, all the evidence points in one direction. Pat got clear of the aircraft but was incapacitated immediately. Had he been conscious, he would have pulled the chute. A tail strike during bailout was a known hazard. The violent spin alone could have rendered Pat unconscious. Whatever the cause, I believe Pat never knew what happened next. He was unconscious, or already gone, before he came to Earth.
Hello and welcome to Airframe Assemblies here on the Isle of Wight. I'm Steve Vizard and the company director. We specialise in restoring and rebuilding World War II aircraft, including Hurricanes, Messerschmitts, but predominantly Spitfires, and have been doing so for 40 years. One of the projects we're currently working on is Spitfire Mark 1 X4009, as flown by Australian ace Pat Hughes. The wrecked remains of this Spitfire were recovered in 1969 by a local private museum, but were sold at auction in 2019 following the death of the museum owner. A friend acquired those parts at the auction sale, and I later mentioned this to Ross Pay, one of our existing Spitfire customers in Australia, who expressed a great interest due to Pat being the highest scoring Battle of Britain Australian ace. The remains of Pat's Spitfire were then transferred to Ross, and an undertaking to rebuild X4009 as a permanent tribute and memorial was established. We here at Airframe Assemblies were given the task of restoring the airframe structure, and we are now well underway with the first element of this, which is the rebuilding of the fuselage, in which we will incorporate all the salvageable parts from X4009 that can be restored or repaired.
I'm John Parker and I'm the public officer of the not-for-profit organisation Hunter Fighter Collection. We were gifted the aircraft by Ross and Anne-Marie Pay, who generously donated it as an ongoing memorial to Patterson Clarence Hughes, Australia's highest scoring Battle of Britain pilot. It's very much an unknown story that needs to be made public.
I was able to acquire X4009 through a friend of mine that I've been involved with a long time in the UK. He first told me about this Mark 1 Spitfire because of the Australian connection, and then the more he told me about it was just, this is unbelievable. How has this story not been told before?
Spitfire Mark 1A X4009 is probably the most significant remaining Spitfire in the world. It is the Battle of Britain aircraft with the highest kill number left. It'll be one of only 4 Mark 1A Spitfires flying, which makes it the rarest and most prestigious aircraft, but also being the aircraft of Patterson Clarence Hughes, who's Australia's top scoring ace, and he was the only person to ever fly the aircraft operationally once it was delivered.
The fact that the Mark 1 Spitfire is obviously the rarest Spitfire of them all, and the fact that there's this untold story of Pat Hughes being Australia's greatest ace from the Battle of Britain, the highest scoring Australian in the Battle of Britain. It's just an unbelievable story, and the more you look into the story and what he achieved in such a short time, it's just unbelievable, and you couldn't help but really become enthused about the whole project.
He was a true hero. He was very brave in his fighting. He used to get far too close to the aircraft that he was shooting down. He was renowned for his instinct and his accuracy and his ability as a pilot.
You know, young bloke, born in Cooma, travels to the other side of the world to help defend Australia and England, and the fact that he gave up his life at such a young age, and you know, obviously with 17 kills to his name, he was more than a fair pilot and marksman.
So in terms of aircraft that are restored, quite often you don't get a significant amount of wreckage, but with this particular aircraft, we estimate it's well over 400 kilos, or over 40 to 60% of the wreck, depending on how you measure a wreck. But this is a very significant aircraft in terms of the remaining components left. So from that viewpoint, it's a very significant restoration.
We've started the restoration of the aircraft, so the biggest job ahead of us now is funding the rest of the restoration. So we're a not-for-profit organisation.
Hunter Fighter Collection has partnered with Vintage Fighter Restorations, based in Scone, to complete the reconstruction and rebuild of Spitfire X4009. VFR have undertaken many restorations of World War II fighter aircraft, including 3 Spitfires, 3 Mustangs and 2 P-40 Kitty Hawks. They are world leaders in the restoration and operation of these types of aircraft. When completed, the Spitfire will be based at Scone, New South Wales, and will be flown at commemorations, events and air shows. It will be permanently retained in Australia and operated as a flying memorial to Pat Hughes, Australia's highest scoring Battle of Britain fighter ace.